and welcome to The Healing Half. My name is Mickey Spear. I am a musician, author, and talk show host of tonight's show. When I was 13 years old, my mom passed away from cancer. I spent the better part of a decade pretending I was fine, avoiding feeling, and absolutely avoiding tough conversations, which is what tonight is going to be all about. But after 10 years, my world was crumbling around me, and I realized I had to get help. So I went to the counselor. I started reading books. I started finally addressing my grief. And now that I've realized the importance of leaning into our emotions, I wanted to start a show where we could address how to help ourselves, whether that's with grief, mental health, like what we're talking about tonight, loss, disappointment, across the board. There's lots of things we need help with ourselves. But I also wanted to do a show that helped us address the wounds of other people and be able to learn more on the insight on what they're going through and how we as a community can help them better. So it is so good to see all of you guys here live, whether you're watching live or as a replay. Say hello in the chat. I love to see that you are here. I just am so grateful for you tonight. And if you stick with me till the end, I've got a free bonus for you. It's called a brain piece worksheet. I put it together. I can't wait to share it with you. And I think it's going to tie in really, really great for tonight's lesson. But you have to be on my email list to get it. So if you're not on there yet, make sure you head to mickyspear.com. Sign up for my weekly resource email where you will get all the notes from tonight's show, plus the replay, plus how you can get in touch with Jenny's organization afterwards. And I'll also send you this free copy of Brain Piece, which I'm really excited. I just think it's gonna help. And I know it's helped me a lot, and I can't wait to have it help you. So before we get into tonight's show, we're talking about removing the stigma of mental health, which is so, so, so important, because I know I've mentioned this before, but there is such a thing that I believe called loss privilege, where depending on how your loss happened or when it happened for you, people might offer you more sympathy. And I know one thing is, as a child who lost a mom to cancer, I have a very high loss privilege, if those are the terms you want to use, in the sense that people feel really bad for me. There's never any awkwardness in regards to what happened to my mom. However, I know a lot of people who have lost loved ones to mental health issues, be it suicide or anything else, and they don't always receive that same, sometimes they do, and that's great, because it's of course deserved. But there's a lot of misunderstanding with mental health illness, mental health in general, and especially suicide. And so tonight's guest is here to talk about her story, her journey, and her organization that I am confident is going to help each and every one of us slowly but surely remove the cultural stigma of mental health. So Jenny, welcome to the show.
I'm not on. Hi.
You're on. Yeah.
Hi, Mickey. I'm on now. Yeah. Hey. No, thank you so much for having me, and what a great introduction to our conversation tonight. And I agree with you. And actually, I speak about that in my book as well, that even within losing someone to suicide, that there's like a hierarchy of whose pain is worse. And I believe pain is pain, right? And so I've attended support groups where people have excused themselves and they've left because, as we were doing introductions, they felt like they didn't qualify to be there because they had only lost a friend or they had only lost a coworker. And that they didn't deserve the right to be in that space with people who had lost, children or spouses. And so I address that in the book and saying, that one person's grief shouldn't be more important than another person's grief.
Amen. That's so awesome. And Jenny, we will go all into your organization in a little bit at the end, but I wanted to quickly pause. I see a lot of people on, which is great. So to everybody listening, Jenny is a fantastic public speaker, author, and she's part of this amazing organization. So she is just the trifecta of things. And so Jenny, I guess just kick it off. Do you mind telling us your story with your dad?
Absolutely. So I first got into the world of speaking about mental health after losing my dad to suicide. So I was actually 20 years old and in the process of
Mm.
getting my degree in psychology when I lost him. And for me, this wasn't just a matter of losing my dad. This was losing the most important person in my life. He
Mm.
had, I was one of 6 kids, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here and they're not. I was his favorite. So,
No, that's okay. Yeah.
I was absolutely his favorite, and, but he was who I was closest to in my life growing up, and he was my safe space. But my dad, when I talk about him, and you'll see on the website if you go there that I have these lists of values, and the very first value listed is one that I call "Be the Village."
Mm. Jenny, can you hear me okay? Sorry, I think there might be a little bit of lag there. Let's see. Hey, technology, right, folks? Sorry,
The
Jenny, can you hear me
people.
okay?
Oh yeah, did I lose you?
I think I either cut out or you cut out. I am so
Okay.
sorry. For everyone
No,
else,
that's
it might
okay.
have been perfect. Do you mind just backing up 2 steps to the value of being the village? Sorry
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah. So to be the village is that we must always surround ourselves with people who push us past our comfort zone in a healthy way. They encourage us during times of self-doubt and love us even when we feel unlovable. And we have to be willing to do the same for others. And that's really that's who my dad raised me to be, is that belief in that right there. And when I lost him, it was like my world stopped. I couldn't
Mm.
breathe. I didn't know how to move forward because everything I had done in my life at that point had been for him. And so I really had to try to get my head around what happened. How did this happen? And I was in a really fortunate position to be getting my degree in psychology. So I returned to school with the support of people around me who encouraged me and pushed me. And when I went back to school, I let all my professors know that I'd lost my dad to suicide and that I needed help understanding what happened to him because the stigma that surrounds suicide, that was not who my dad was,
Mm.
and I'd like to say that that's not really who anyone is. And that's what we'll talk about tonight, is really breaking down that stigma and helping people understand, the importance of healthy conversations and how our perspective and how we look at mental health truly impacts the way that we respond to the people around us. So it will impact our ability to ask for help as well as offer help to those in need.
Mm.
But I will tell you that beyond losing my dad to suicide, so everyone knows the whole story, and why I do what I do and why I'm so passionate about it, is that 5 years later, I went through my own postpartum depression, even
Mm.
though I was a trained crisis counselor and public educator on suicide prevention. I missed all my own signs, and I became suicidal.
Sorry about
And
that.
no, that was awesome. So, so yes, I became suicidal, and I was fortunate that my husband at the time, that when he came home and realized that I was struggling, and I looked at him and I said, "I'm scared I'm going to die," that
Mm.
he knew what I was saying, because he had been there when I lost my dad, and he knew to take me serious. And he also knew what had helped me when I lost my dad. And so when I lost my dad, I began having panic attacks. And a classmate of mine actually pushed me really hard to go get acupuncture as a way to deal with that. And so, yeah, so for me, I was able to overcome my postpartum depression with the use of acupuncture and herbs. And so, so that was my way of healing. And then to go even further, in 2019, it's so weird. These years are all blending together, but
Right.
in
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I know, 2019, my daughter was 15 years old at the time, and I almost lost her to suicide. She was
Mm.
going through her own mental health crisis. So that's kind of my like 3 generations of, mental health struggles, and why I do believe it's so important that we're having these conversations.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing, Jenny. Both, I'm so sorry for your loss of your wonderful dad. I cannot wait to hear more about him. And like you said, like being able to destigmatize what it actually looks like to be struggling. I'm sorry that you had to go through postpartum depression. I'm so glad that you found some solutions, but it's so important to be aware, like you said, that that's a thing. And just to talk about that, because that's so many moms go through that. And then also, I'm sorry that your daughter went through that too. But I'm so
Thank you.
glad that she has a mom like you who's aware of this stuff and is, like you said, and it's a weird twist of fate, but you happen to have a lot of experience with this going in. So I'm so
Right.
glad that she has
Thank you.
you. And
Thank
so I think
you.
oh, sorry, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say that I actually, I'm able to look at all 3 of those situations and be able to recognize, and this is part of what I try to teach people around perspective, is even the perspective of our own stories and our
Yeah.
experiences. So for me, when I lost my dad, it was really important that I find something good from this situation. And when I first, became a crisis counselor and an educator on suicide prevention, that's what I thought it was like, you know what, I couldn't help him, so I'm going to help other people. But it was years later. I mean, years later, it's probably, I think it was around 2012. So about 13 years after I lost my dad, that I realized his death didn't just support me in helping other people. His death saved my life. Right.
Mm.
So even like the way I just explained it, my husband, he understood, he knew to take me serious. And I don't know that that would have been the case if we had not lost my dad the way that we did. And so, yeah, so I'm able to look at that. And as much as it was excruciatingly painful to go through that loss, I'm here. I'm here for my kids. And I have spent 20 years learning about this and trying to understand it. And so I was able to then be here for my daughter as she was going through her own crisis and navigating that. And that may be, because I know we only have so much time, but maybe on another show we talk about youth mental health and what happened to her, so people can understand like how she ended up in the situation she did. Because this is what I do, I'm like, this is what I do. How did I almost lose my daughter? But tonight is about stigma and really helping people, have this conversation. And one of the things that I would love to do, and I've actually never done this in an interview like this, but I would love to read to you something out of the book.
We
Which
would be so honored.
I want to say too. So this is Growing Through Grief. I'm trying to turn it. This is a book that was actually originally meant to be a letter. I was asked by a friend of mine about 15 years after I lost my dad. She knew what I had gone through when I lost him, and she knew my own struggles with mental health. She had 2 friends who each lost a loved one to suicide within a week of each other. And she reached out to me and she said, would you be willing to write my friends a letter letting them know that healing is possible? And so I was like, wow, okay. So I sat down to write that letter. And a couple weeks later, I called her and I said, hey, I haven't forgotten you. I'm working on it. It's just, I don't know where to stop. And so I sent her what I was working on, and she called me back and she said, don't stop. Like, you have a message that needs to be heard. Keep writing. So actually I did end up sending her a letter. It's one of the final chapters in the book. It's called The Lessons I Learned. And so that was a letter, but yeah, 3 years after starting this letter, it became a published book. And it was something that I knew I couldn't profit off of, having gone through this myself. I have lived all over the country as well as internationally, and I've met people everywhere that have lost someone to suicide. And so for me, this is something that we raise money to be able to donate this book to anyone in need. And really, honestly, it's whatever loss you've been through, whether it was to someone losing someone to suicide or a car accident or cancer or whatever your loss was. I've actually been told I should change the subheading so that it's really just loss, So on here, it's a guide to healthy healing after losing a loved one to suicide. But really, it's healing to any trauma, any loss. So if anyone's on here, if you're interested in a copy, please, you can go to the website and request a copy and we'll get one out to you. But one of the ways that I try to help destigmatize suicide, and first let's talk about what is the stigma. So there's the stigma around suicide is the idea that this is a choice, or the idea that this person was weak or that they were vengeful. But there's a lot of misconceptions about what someone is going through when they die from suicide. So I want to read to you actually, shortly after my dad passed away, we found letters that he had written. And so this is, I'll read you just a couple short passages, but on February 4th, 1999, my dad wrote, "I got better because I had hope that things were getting better. I can't go through this again." April 26th, 1999, "I can't work and I can't think, and I'm not sure if the pain is physical or mental. I wish only the best for each of you, and I feel like I'm keeping you from being able to move ahead with your lives. I have been desperate and confused for months. Please forgive me for not being able to do better." May 1999. "The medicines have helped and hurt. When I am not depressed, I cannot sleep. I am sorry. It's just too much, and I know how hard it is on the rest of you. I love all of you. I have been depressed for 5 months, and I know it has been hard on all of you. I am afraid I'm losing my grip on reality. I have said I'm living in the twilight zone, and I know it's getting worse. Please forgive me for not being able to deal with this." And so I ask people, when you hear this, does this sound like a man who is choosing to be this way? Does it sound like a man who is being vengeful? Does it sound like a man who's just weak and giving up? He was struggling every day, and none of us really knew how much he was struggling. We didn't understand how to help him. We didn't know how to support him. And so that's why I do what I do, is because my dad was doing everything that most people consider is the right way to treat mental illness, which was he was working with a psychiatrist, seeing him 1 to 2 times a week, depending on the severity of his symptoms. And he was on antidepressants, and so he was doing what he thought was the right thing to do, but he was not getting better. And even in there where he says, "I've been struggling with this for 5 months," he had been struggling for 1.5 years, right? I mean, it just shows you how even his own awareness of the situation wasn't correct. So I read that, really just to help people understand the state of mind that he was in. Because a lot of times when we lose someone, and especially when that's not what we think of them, that's not how we see them, it was such a gift. As painful as it was to read these letters, it was such a gift to be able to read these and now be able to share them with people who maybe they lost someone and there was no letter.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I'm over here sobbing. Thank you so much for sharing. And I always say, we cry on the show, right? You guys who are in the comments, we cry on the show. So thank you for being vulnerable and for sharing his amazing letters. Like you said, what a bittersweet blessing to have those.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. As you kind of talked about, there are does he seem vengeful? Does he seem this? Do you mind diving into the reactions that you got after your dad passed away? Like, again, I mentioned I got cancer support. So people are all like, yeah, that's awful. It's terrible. So I know it's not always the case with suicide.
Right. And what's really interesting is, I wish we had more time. I would go into this.
You just keep talking. We'll figure it out.
So what's really interesting for everyone that's on here that doesn't know, I told Nikki as we were getting started that I'm getting a divorce. And so my husband and I, we got married right after my dad died, actually. So my dad died on June 2nd, 1999. My husband and I got married on July 31st of 99. So we've been married 21 years. And we've agreed to get a divorce. And what has been surreal to me is that the reaction to me announcing to people that we're getting a divorce has been very similar to the way it was when I lost my dad. And it's actually brought up a lot of grief for me around my dad, and grief that I hadn't felt in years. And I always tell people, like, grief is interesting because we can go through just excruciating pain and to the point that we feel guilty for laughing,
Right.
and then we have these periods where we don't feel any pain and we feel guilty for not feeling pain. And, it's just this like crazy cycle. And again, even in the book, I talk about that. Like there's, I know when I lost my dad, I was taught about the grief wheel, right? And it's this cycle that we go through and it's so clean and pretty. And I remember sitting there looking at it and going, that is not what I'm going through. Like I am going through, I don't want to say a bad word. I am going through I was going to say a shitstorm of emotions.
You can say that,
right?
absolutely, no problem.
So I actually call it the grief landmine, right? Because every step you take can be a different emotion. And so I created that. It's in the book. It talks about what the grief landmine really is like. But yeah, it was interesting when I lost my dad. I lost almost all of my friends. No one knew how to be around me. They didn't know how to talk to me. Everyone was so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they just said nothing, especially my childhood friends where I grew up. And oftentimes I found this need to comfort them. Like when I would say that I lost my dad to suicide, that then, yeah, I found myself comforting them to be like, no, but I'm okay. It's okay. You don't have to worry about me. And it was really kind of a bizarre time. And then there was also a lot of pressure around, is she done crying yet? Is she done being sad? And what people didn't understand, and I wasn't expecting because I didn't know, but now, 21, almost 22 years later, for a lot of people, the second year is the hardest. The first year is kind of shock and disbelief, and it's painful. It's truly painful, heart-wrenching. But the second year is when it starts to sink in, like the reality of it. And yeah, I mean, so for me, the second year was definitely the hardest. And again, people didn't know how to respond to me.
Wow, I'm so sorry. I'm like, I wish I could just hug you to the screen. We're hugging you through the screen. I think that notion of people don't know what to say, so they end up not saying anything. And then again, how many people end up just falling off your radar altogether? That is so much more common than I think people think, whether it's a suicide death or not, but I'm sure suicide magnifies that. So is there something that you wish they would have said? Like, I guess if you could go
So
back
here's what
to
I
those
tell
friends
people. Like I've actually
say.
had people show up at my house, like ringing my doorbell because they've lost someone to suicide and they're in such grief and just disbelief. And rather than even calling me, like they are at my house. And what I tell them is there is no perfect thing to say. There is no right response other than to be present, right? Show up. And when you're about to speak to this person, and again, it doesn't matter what their loss is or what their trauma is, or maybe they're going through the depression right now, right? Maybe they're going through extreme anxiety right now, is to think about what you're about to say. Is what you're going to say coming from a place of love? Is it coming from a place of compassion and awareness? Are you trying to support them to feel whole and to feel loved by the people around them? Or is what you're about to say going to be shameful? Is it going to be hurtful? Right? And I had an experience right when my dad died. When I went back home that day, I got to the house. And again, I grew up with 6 brothers and sisters. We had friends over all the time. We had exchange students. The house I grew up in was chaos. So to walk into my childhood house to silence, it was so uncanny and eerie. And I walked in and I'm just like, where is everyone? And this man walked up to me and I recognized him, but I didn't know who he was. But he walked up to me and he hugged me and he said, "Jenny, don't worry, your dad didn't go to hell." And I was like, what? And I'm pulling away and I'm in such disbelief. And my brother suddenly surrounded me and pulled me away from him and embraced me. And so the 4 of us are standing there crying and talking. And And I never spoke to this man again, but he was someone from my parents' church. And it wasn't until, so this is 1999. It was not until 2017 that I was on the phone with a friend of mine who knew that I was writing the book. And I shared with her this story and how upset I was by what he said. And she taught me a really important lesson because she said, Jenny, I don't think he was trying to hurt you. I think, and I don't even think he was trying to be insensitive. I think he was trying his best to console you and he didn't know what else to say. Right. And it was just like, oh my gosh, for, like 18 years or whatever, like, or I'm not doing the math right. But in any case, like I've been holding on to this resentment and this anger toward this man who was trying to support me. And so what I tell people is you might go into it with the best intentions and you might say something that to you is coming from a place of love, but to the person who is hurting, they may not be able to receive it that way. So be patient with them. And then I tell the people who are hurting, try to be patient with those who are trying to support you, right? And it can be hard because when you're in a state of shock and a state of pain, it's hard to receive any message. I mean, even now, like going through the divorce, I have a very good friend who is going through a divorce, but he started his process a year ago, and he will reach out to me knowing what I'm going through, and he'll tell me how loved I am. And I've written back to him and I said, cognitively, I know that. Like, I know I'm loved, but on an emotional level, I can't feel it. I can't feel it right now. And so, I just like what I tell people is the greatest tool we have that we can use to help anyone, ourselves or those around us. It's love. It's absolutely, that is the strongest, most powerful tool we have.
That's so beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing and being so vulnerable. I loved what you said about you can don't overthink what you're going to say. It's better to say something and then learn how to apologize if it comes off wrong than to be silent, because that silence is so loud. It is so
and just
loud.
go and invite them to lunch or, let's go for a walk. And the thing is, even if you say to them, I don't know what to say, but I'm here, right? Just show up, and while we're talking about it, I do want to point out, if you haven't noticed, my language is so important. And so when I talk about mental health, when I talk about suicide, you will never hear me say that my dad committed suicide. You'll never hear me say that he took his own life, even though that has been deemed politically correct, or that he killed himself. Like, that's another one that seems to be correct. However, again, I want you to think back. Did this sound like a man who chose this? Because all three of those statements would reflect that he chose that. And what I tell people is if my dad had been healthy, he would still be alive today, right?
Yeah.
He would have never chosen suicide if he had been healthy. So what you will hear me say is that I lost my dad to suicide, or that he lost his battle with depression. And on the website, I actually have listed out there under our resources where you can read that phrases that are shaming someone who's going through a mental health struggle or has died from suicide versus phrases that are supportive. And I'm not one, like if I'm talking to someone and they've been through this themselves, whether they themselves have been suicidal or they lost someone, I never tell anyone how to talk. Right?
Yeah.
But I do try to raise awareness and say, like, please be mindful of the words you're using, because the words we use truly impact the way we feel. So I just encourage people to think about that. Are we using words that are adding shame to this situation, or are recognizing that there was an illness or an imbalance for that person, and then honoring who the person was? We need to separate the two.
That is so beautiful. And for those of you guys who don't know, my brother-in-law Brendan passed away from suicide. And that language, like you said, it is really important. And we knew right away, don't say committed, because it feels like it was a choice. And my mom didn't choose to die from cancer. And you don't choose to have depression. And like those beautiful painful letters that your dad had, you could see, like you said, like the warped sense of reality. That's why we're here, is to
Yeah.
destigmatize it. So thank you so much for being on the show. Do you mind
So
telling us a little bit about Growing Out of Darkness, what you guys do, especially in regards to the stigma, and how everyone who's listening, both live and
yeah.
afterwards, can get involved?
Yeah. So I don't even remember if I started out talking about this, but so people talk about ending the stigma all the time, but very few people talk about how to do it. And I think it's because most people don't know how to do it. And there is this misconception that the way we're going to do it is by talking about mental health more. And I will disagree with that. It is actually not how often we talk about mental health, but how we talk about it. So being aware of our language, being aware of how we're approaching conversations. Are you approaching it from a place of wellness, a place of from a place of understanding and compassion, or are you talking about it from a place of fear and pain and loss? And so just being aware of that. And so what we do at Growing Out of Darkness, as I mentioned, we donate copies of Growing Through Grief to anyone in need. And then we also offer education sessions where we go in and we do presentations on healing, on loss, on ending the stigma. We customize the presentations to whatever that group, that community, whether it's a church, a school, or a business. But it really is about going in and changing the dialogue and helping people to know what their options are, which would have to be another episode on another show where we really go into what else is there beyond the traditional means of getting help when you're going through something like this.
Thank you so much. For everybody watching, just know the link for that website is in the comment section. So please, please, please check it out. Please consider donating. And if you are on my email list, I'll make sure that is sent out 50 times to make sure that you guys all know how to get in touch with Jenny. And I am just so happy to have met you. What a blessing that our lives crossed paths. I'm so grateful for you, for your journey, for your message. And thank you so much for your wisdom tonight. Truly, you are saving lives. And that is just so beautiful.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be here tonight. And your energy is just, I love it. I love it. So I would talk to you every day, every day.
Well, okay. Give me a call any day. I would love to talk with you every day. And for those of you listening, if you want to have Jenny back on, give us like a yes or an amen in the comments section, because I would for sure love to have Jenny back on. I think you've got a well of knowledge, and we just got one drop tonight. So thank you so much for being here. I really, really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You guys, this is an important topic that every single person needs to talk about. A conversation about mental health is always a conversation well spent. So extra thank you to Jenny. And for those of you who, like me, have lost someone to suicide, I just want you to know tonight might have brought up a lot of emotions. So be extra kind to yourself. Give yourself a little bit of grace tomorrow, because I'm sure some stuff was stirred up. And if you haven't yet, make sure you check out both Jenny's book, which sounds amazing, as well as my book, My Heart Still Remembers. If you are going through all of that grief stuff, it's on my website. Make sure you check that out. And then speaking of books and reflections, I have a really good mentor friend, and his name is David Brook. He is called the Gratitude Guy. He is a very successful international speaker out of Seattle, and him and I came up with this little thing. So David's dad and mom both struggled really bad with mental illness, and his dad passed away from suicide, and his mom had complications along the way, but ultimately it wasn't suicide, but she was very depressed her whole life. And so it's a very sensitive issue for David. And he came to me one day when we were just talking over our Zoom coffee, and he says, man, I just wish I could help people figure out ways that they can help themselves, to know if they need to go get help or if they're just having a bad day. Because I think a lot of times people think, oh, it's just a bad day. And then those bad days get to the point where you're pretty much out of control. And I know it's so much more complicated than that. But with David and I, who are not doctors, we came up with this thing that he's like, I just wish I could share this with people. It's just a quick way to check in on ourselves on if we're doing healthy brain activities. Brain Peace was the acronym we came up for. We came up with a little booklet that you can just pin on your fridge and be like, here's how I can be mindful. Here's some ways I can restrict screen time. And you just kind of go down this list and just make sure you're doing the basics when it comes to mental health. And of course, if you're doing all these things and you're still struggling, the biggest part of Brain Peace is to encourage people like myself to keep going to the counselor and to keep your doctors informed, because that's the biggest thing is most people, a lot of people don't get to that point before they end up passing away from suicide. So this is something I just wanted to talk about tonight. David shared it with his very large audience, which I'm so grateful for. So I just wanted to share it with you guys too. So if you're on my email list, I'll send you this copy. I hope it helps you. I know I've got my copy pinned on the fridge. So on days that I'm having a little bit harder of a time, I can be like, okay, have I slept well? Have I connected with my community? And I just kind of go through my checklist, be like, okay, maybe that's what I need. And sometimes that's not enough, which is why I still go to the counselor, and I'm still a huge advocate for that. So hopefully this is just another tool in your tool belt. And of course, head over to Growing Out of Darkness and see all the amazing resources that they have for you guys as well. Thank you all so much for being here. You mean the world to me. I will see you next week. We got kind of a funky show next week. I'm going to be doing it live from my grandma's house, and it's going to be right around her first angelversary, which if you know me, you know my grandma was very, very close to me, and it's going to be really hard, but it's going to be emotional. There might be a song or two involved, and we're going to be actually doing it from her house in Arizona, and it's going to be talking about legacy. So I will see you next week for a unique episode of The Healing Half. But thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see you. If you've got questions for me or Jenny, feel free to throw them in the comments, and we'll happily go through it. Bye, everyone.